Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Little Women from 2019. Although I've never read the Louisa May Alcott book, Little Women, I grew up watching the 1994 film adaptation with Winona Ryder and Susan Sarandon and Claire Danes and everybody quite a lot. My mom is a big fan of the book, even goes by Marmee is her kind of grandma name. I guess that's how you say that. We watched a lot. I willingly watched. I really like the 1994 version. It's not something I hear people talk about a lot when they talk about 90s cinema, which is a shame because it's a really faithful, good adaptation. And I loved it. And I think I saw the 33 or the 30s version once or twice, or probably just once. And I wasn't aware of the 40s one or the modern one, which, like, yikes. So I sort of, in a way, basically know the story of Little Women. The interesting thing is when you know a particular story, or when you're going into kind of a remake of something or a different adaptation of something, you kind of know the flow of the story, you know how it's going to move. And I did not feel that way at all in Greta Gerwig's version of Little Women, which I actually thought was really interesting. I've never seen someone adapt a story in such a way that I almost sort of didn't feel like I was watching. I was watching Little Women, but it didn't feel like I was watching kind of like the same old kind of adaptation, which, since most of the adaptations, to my understanding, are pretty literal and faithful, it seems to be that's the kind of take you do with Little Women. Greta Gerwig kind of reinvented it in a way that was really refreshing and different, and having this be from kind of like Jo kind of looking back on her childhood and growing up with her sisters and kind of being a writer. And it kind of bounces back and forth between the past and the sort of supposed, or even though it's the past that this film takes place, in the present of this movie. I really, really enjoyed kind of that way to tell Little Women. Definitely felt like a totally different version of it. I think one of the interesting things about this version of it is it almost feels like when the other versions are like, okay, this is the new updated version, even though it still takes place in the past for the most part, almost to sort of like replace the other one because that one's too old and this is the newer, more modern version. And this one feels like it more stands with them than in a way to kind of replace them, because I think, my mom grew up more with the Katharine Hepburn version, but then my sister and brother and I grew up with the 1994 Winona Ryder one. And then I think this one doesn't really aim to do that when you think of new remakes or adaptations. It sort of means to kind of stand next to it, which is sort of interesting because I saw a lot of mothers bring their daughters to this film, and I was kind of wondering if this is the best way to sort of introduce someone to this story. I kind of liked it because I knew the story, I knew the ins and outs of it, but if you're coming to this and this is your first time seeing this, I'm kind of curious what those little girls thought of it, or how they'll frame, what would be their adaptation of Little Women. Would it be this, or would they kind of resort to the TV miniseries version, or, countless, there's a lot of adaptations of Little Women, but would they choose the more literal one rather than the one that's like less linear? Or maybe they'll like that about it. I'm sort of two minds of it, but I still really like this adaptation, but I do wonder, as this is very much a generational thing that a lot of people pass down to their kids, particularly mothers to daughters, would you want such a radical adaptation or not, regardless of something like that? Not to denote it, I think it's a great movie, but I'm just, pointing out that you probably want someone to know the story as it's more traditionally told for the most part. But I'm also kind of I don't know, I kind of like this, and maybe I should have more faith in these kids, but it did feel like, we've done this so many times, let's do it differently. And I will say, as someone who is familiar with it, I found that really refreshing and really interesting, because I sort of didn't know where it was going to go next. So it wasn't like, okay, and then they're going to get to this part and that part. It felt like kind of like reorganizing the pieces made it feel like a completely different puzzle in a lot of ways. Especially this, what I've heard people call a meta-narrative, which I sort of agree with, but referred to as that of the idea that Jo is essentially like Louisa May Alcott, and that she's writing Little Women this whole time, which I guess in some versions it's like hinted at or something. And this is evidently clear, and it kind of merges kind of some biographical information, which I know other versions have as well, of Louisa May Alcott with Jo. I always looked at her as basically Jo. And, from when I was a kid, I always thought that was what was going on anyway. Maybe it's because I'm more used to the more modern film adaptations, and that's like what they're basically saying. But this one very much goes into that, even, having full biographical information of Luisa May Alcott in the character of Joe in certain scenes. It kind of is being more explicit about that than I guess previous adaptations were, but I think it definitely works for it, and it kind of ties it together a lot more. And I really liked how the cast had such great chemistry together. You definitely got the sense of them as a family. I'd say they have like great kind of, I guess, family chemistry. I'm not sure how you're supposed to say that, but I don't think I've ever seen a Little Women where they sort of like kind of talk over each other. I'm not sure if that was like an Altman thing or just that families talk over each other, which I thought worked really well. It kind of made their kind of chemistry in them as sisters work even better and feel like more realistic. The casting of everyone was pretty remarkable. From Saoirse Ronan as Joe, who's just almost feels like almost too perfect, but she's really great. But she feels a lot more strong-willed than I remember Winona Ryder being, and very much Greta Gerwig's version of Joe, to me at least. Florence Pugh as Amy was kind of an interesting choice because she is supposed to be younger, but didn't come across to me. When I was watching the movie, I thought she was older than the actress who's playing Beth. So in my mind, even though I know this story, or I should know it better, to be honest with you, I probably should have watched the 90s one before I saw it. In my mind, while I was watching, I thought Beth was younger than Amy, just because Florence Pugh kind of looks a lot older, although I don't think there's like that much between them in age, but those two actresses. But I know this is kind of Florence Pugh's year between Midsommar and Fighting with My Family and this, and she does another really great performance. Apparently her monologue was kind of written by Greta Gerwig kind of on the fly that she says about marriage, which I think she does a really great job at. And her development with the romance with Laurie, I guess, works a little better than most, or that's what I've read. I did like her in this. I don't know if it's like as good of her performance as Midsommar, but she kind of gave you kind of like the aloofness and the silliness of her as a child, but you kind of saw the evolution of her as a woman, which obviously you're supposed to see through all these people, but I thought she did it rather well with a part that normally feels smaller to me in the 90s one than this one. She wasn't a character that stands out as much to me personally as she did in this one, which I think helped from Florence Pugh's performance. This adaptation felt more centered on Joe and Amy than the other one. The 90s one felt a little more spread out in terms of, I mean, Joe's always the center, but in terms of the other characters, and this one felt more like Joe and Amy centric. You do get stuff with Meg, played by Emma Watson, who I like some of the stuff they're doing with her and her husband, who, even though it's hard and even though they're very poor, some of those scenes are really great, and specifically when she talks about like, hey, you know, just because you want to be a writer and you don't want to be married doesn't mean I don't want to. You can't inflict those goals on me, which I think is like something a lot of people need to hear in general, but I thought the way they played that scene was very perfect in terms of like, just because your vision of someone or your goals for someone doesn't necessarily reflect their life goals in itself, and I thought that was very like a good scene for families to see, frankly. But I didn't really like Emma Watson. She's not like my favorite actress outside of Harry Potter. I don't think she's ever really had that one performance that's made me go, oh, she's this crazy great talent, why isn't she more stuff? It kind of, don't really get it outside of Harry Potter, and I really like her as Hermione, which is sort of weird. Never really struck me as much. I like Laura Dern as Marmee. She felt, I wouldn't say like, felt more reserved. She felt more like in the background than previous ones I've seen. Marmee felt like more important to the plot, but again, I haven't seen them in a while, so maybe I'm wrong. And Meryl Streep is sort of just in it for a little bit. I actually quite liked Timothée Chalamet though, because he is Laurie, because it feels like he's almost playing with the persona of like him playing like the smart, beautiful, rich boy or something, and kind of playing him more as, you know, Laurie's sort of a jerk. He's weird and he's a total jerk, and I think you kind of get that, and he's kind of, I don't know, I felt like he was sort of messing with that persona a little bit. Maybe I'm just reading too much into that. And then the weirdest thing of this whole movie, and I'm surprised nobody brings this up like at all, other than that Chris Cooper looks way shorter for some reason. I can't really figure that out. But also that Bob Odenkirk plays the dad. That, like, my wife and I made like faces at each other like, what the fuck? Like, somehow I missed that Bob Odenkirk was playing the dad. I guess that was probably like in some news report I read, and it was like low, and I'm like, didn't read it or forgot it or something. And like seeing him when he shows up as the dad definitely like totally took me out of the movie. That was very weird. I'm still not over that. That was weird casting. I don't think that worked at all. I like this adaptation of Little Women. I think it shows Greta Gerwig as a filmmaker, because oftentimes when you have the kind of directorial sophomore effort, it almost feels like Frances Ha is like pretty much hers, or same with Mistress America. And then we got to Lady Bird. Anyway, Lady Bird is like considered the directorial debut, and this is kind of the sophomore film. It feels like a much more creative filmmaker. I really like Greta Gerwig as a filmmaker and a writer and a star, but I feel like this film shows how much more she's capable of than we initially realized, and I didn't think she would do like a period piece. I didn't think she would screw this up or anything. I was kind of surprised at how much she could really bring to this material and kind of make it her own and make her own kind of different adaptation that no one's really thought of, as well as being very traditional. It shows kind of a maturity, which is something you want to show with your sophomore effort anyway, it seems to be. But at the same time, I think it shows how she can breathe her personality and her style as a writer and a director, and breathe life into an adaptation like this and like give it its own kind of spin on it. It almost feels like more like Greta Gerwig's version of Little Women than just Little Women. You know, it's like I don't really know who directed the other Little Women movies, just off the top of my head. This felt like an auteur Little Women movie, which I think is pretty amazing. I thought that was a really cool choice, you know. And again, what you would want to do if you're doing a director sophomore kind of film, you'd want to do your big auteur move, and it's interesting that this was hers. You know, in some ways I think these stories feel very kind of like modest and just about simple things like these girls becoming women and maturing in their lives, going in some ways that they plan, in other ways they don't, and you know, Meg dies and all that stuff. Spoilers, I guess. But I found that to be really wonderful with this version of Little Women, is that this is Greta Gerwig's Little Women. That's the way it felt. And I don't think I've ever thought of a Little Women that I didn't describe by Katharine Hepburn or Winona Ryder or whomever was in it. And that's how I always thought of it. I think in this Little Women, I think the real star of it is almost the director, and it still has a killer cast. It has so much to offer. It's a really spectacular kind of movie. I don't know, it seems like people are either totally ignoring this or overly praising it. I don't know if that 90s Little Women kind of means a lot to me and growing up and everything, so I don't want to just go like, this is so amazing and everything. I kind of want to sit with this for a while. I do sort of feel like, in a way, the way it's adapted sort of reminds me of what happened with fairy tales, where for a long time we had these very traditionally told animated films, and then Shrek happened, and suddenly we have to sort of acknowledge that we're very aware this is a fairy tale and all the problems with it. And I don't think this has a problem with the source material, but I think it's like saying, like, you've seen this so many times, we have to do it differently. But I think there is some cause for doing it traditionally so a new generation can experience that. But in some ways, maybe it needs to be loosened up to continue to be as relevant as it has been these past 150 years. In a lot of ways, I think Greta Gerwig has sort of basically done that while still being very traditional. She's just done kind of like an amazing job doing this adaptation of Little Women. It's just in the canon of Little Women adaptations, it's one that I think kind of stands on its own, but stands on its own in a way that I don't think replaces anything. It kind of, and not to say each one needs to replace it, but I think it kind of lets you enjoy the older ones while also seeing this one, and you can enjoy both for like entirely separate reasons, and particularly for the way they adapted. They kind of almost feels like it plays off of one another rather than trying to like play the same song as one another, which I think is probably one of the more interesting things about this. And I honestly am so surprised, because it feels like when we get kind of more literary kind of adaptations, they try to say it very traditional and literal, and as much as it's shot that way and costumed that way and the production design is that way, the direction chose not to be that way, and it's so much more radical, I think, as an adaptation, as a film, than it really has any right to be. I think that's what made it so fantastic and memorable, and kind of leaves you with such an impression of this version of Little Women. So if you've seen Little Women and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.